And speaking of that, last time I forgot to pause the recording before showing those Good Place videos, and that resulted in the video getting blocked for copyright infringement reasons in the US. So when I have some time, I guess at the end of this week, I'll have to do some editing magic on the video and cut those bits out and then put it back up on YouTube for those who, unfortunately, for whatever reason, had to miss the discussion. And it's also useful for those who are able to make it to go back to it for study purposes. Oh yeah, thank you, Grace, I appreciate that. So this week we're gonna continue, today we're gonna continue talking about Kant's ethics, deontology. We'll examine some criticisms and at least as I understand Kantian ethics, I hope to deflate some of the rather superficial criticisms that Vaughan leverages against him. And then we'll transition to a discussion of Aristotle and virtue ethics. And we'll probably have to carry that over just a little bit for Monday before transitioning to a conversation about feminist ethics and ethics of care in particular. Yeah, so are there any questions about anything or any issues? Okay, so as we usually do, I want to get started before jumping back into the Kant discussion. I'd like to get started with some breakout rooms to give you guys an opportunity to chat for a little bit regarding the prompts for this week's discussion forum. And you might also take some time to talk about your approach to the question for the reflection paper. But as is always the case in my directions for this, you don't have to talk about everything, right? You might as a group just choose to pick a couple of things. So let me pull that up. Oh, but actually, before doing that, I just wanted to say a couple things that I neglected to introduce in the course of our conversation. Hold on. Okay, here's Connor. So we talked about the trolley problem quite a bit already, but that actually has a less abstract and more pragmatically meaningful application, especially with respect to developing technologies. So for example, and I'll just share this and I might send it out to you all in an announcement if you find it interesting, because we're not gonna read through the whole article, but I'll share the screen here. This is a fairly recent article in the Technology Review asking this question: should a self-driving car kill the baby or the grandma? Depends on where you're from, right? So here the trolley problem is applied to the, again, pragmatic issue of engineers and technologists having to, in a reflective, hopefully thoughtful way, embed in their algorithms in developing these applications, obviously automatic responses to environmental dangers or conflicts when they arise, right? So your car or the self-driving car, if it is perhaps in a position that it confronts, I don't know, a person or perhaps several persons in the road, and it might have to make a decision. Perhaps it can't quickly enough engage the brakes before any violence would occur. So then an alternative would be to veer the car to the left or something. But what if veering the car to the left now threatens some other individuals or persons, right? So programmers, engineers who are behind putting these kinds of technological instruments together have to make these considerations, right? So what should the car decide, so to speak, in these events? So the question isn't just this kind of abstract or abstruse kind of thought experimentation. It has real world applications, making it thus kind of concretely experimental. And yeah, so that's again in connection to utilitarianism, but we can of course pose the trolley problem to any ethicist or any representative of a particular moral theory. So maybe before I put you into the groups, I might ask, since we're talking about Kant, how do you suppose Kant would respond to the conditions of the classical trolley problem? So it's obvious what the utilitarian would do, at least in the context of the classical representation of the issue, but it becomes muddier when you reposition it, such as in the hospital room where someone is considering harvesting organs, or if you might have to, rather than pulling a lever, it becomes more personal if in fact you have to push someone off of a bridge, right? The movie iRobot, so I'm looking at the chat, Connor said, that aspect about who should the AI pick or something to that extent. Oh, okay. I haven't seen that film actually, but yeah, I'm sure that this has come up in a variety of ways in a number of popular culture contexts. But how do you suppose Kant might respond to this issue? Do you think Kant would agree with at least the moral intuition that we find in alignment with utilitarianism, or how do you think he would handle it? So do you think Kant would recommend or advocate or insist in terms of the ethics of the situation on pulling the lever, thus killing the one person rather than the five? To use the other scenario, the more disturbing one, do you suspect Kant would endorse pushing the fat man off the bridge in order to pose an obstacle in the path of the train? What do you guys think? So Connor says no. So does that mean, going to the classical situation, that Kant would say you should not pull the lever, which would result in the death of the five? What do you think? Or is there some third alternative that perhaps we're not considering?
It's tough because Kant's I Kant's theory, it seems very different than the utilitarian perspective. So it's kind of tough to compare them in this case.
Yeah, and so some utilitarians, such as well, Philippa Foot to some extent, although she's not entirely aligned with the utilitarian, or at least act utilitarianism, but some utilitarians take that problem, that unclarity in terms of what is recommendable in the pursuit of moral action, to be a symptom of a deficiency in Kantian ethics, because Kant would appear to have no good answer. Because if you say, pull the lever and kill the one, well, what are you doing? You're using that one person as a means to the end of saving the five, right? But then, as we learned from the existentialist perspective of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, if you say, well, I'm not going to do anything, well, effectively what that means, and you should be cognizant of this as the agent acting in the particular situation, well, that means that the five are going to die. So by some reasoning, you might say, from Kant's own kind of perspective, that in this situation, you are effectively using the five as a means to the end of not killing the one, or perhaps of misguidedly assuaging your own conscience, or something like that. So there doesn't appear to be any straightforward answer, given that we must, in every case, as ethical beings, respect the autonomy, that is, the condition of one being an end in oneself as a moral person. And it seems that everything you do in this kind of situation would neglect such an orientation of respect, or undermine it, or or something else. But then someone from a Kantian perspective might say, or perhaps even from a virtue theoretical perspective, might say, well, I don't understand the role and purpose of ethics in human life to be an instrumental or algorithmic sort of tool for immediate problem solving. That is, and I think this is something good actually about Kantianism and virtue ethics. That is to say, those who represent or endorse those viewpoints are more inclined to recognize the tragic aspect of terrible events in the world and moral failures. So rather than saying, oh, pull the switch, kill the one, save the five, I guess I did my duty, you would say, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe I will pull the switch, but that's not necessarily morally right. I ended up killing someone, and that's terrible. And someone from Aristotle's point of view too might say, it's not entirely clear that it's more virtuous to kill one person rather than five. And so there would be a more concrete and vigorous moral struggle or period of deliberation or something involved. That is to say, in other words, when we look at virtue theory and deontology, so Kant's theory, it seems that we're more inclined to recognize the limits of the ethical in its capacity to solve our problems of a moral nature or whatever else. And so that's why, by the way, utilitarianism as a moral theory has most commonly been embraced by structures and proponents of capitalism as an economic theory, because it's all about efficiency, right? Recognizing a problem only to jump over it or to resolve or dissolve it. Okay. So I'll go ahead now, if there are no follow-up comments or questions about that, I'll go ahead and create these breakout rooms and give you guys a little bit of an opportunity to discuss the discussion forum prompts for this week. So before I do that, I'll just go back to those prompts and I'll read them out loud, just so you guys are clear. So the first one on Moodle, this is under week 4, of course. What elements of Kant's theory do you think could or should be part of any viable moral theory? So you might, for some reasons, disagree with Kant, but in any case, you could recognize aspects of his theoretical approach as invaluable. That is, aspects that ought to be baked in, as it were, to any moral theory that you would ultimately embrace. And then the second question that you might consider, how does Aristotle's conception of the virtuous life differ from Kant's? We haven't yet discussed Aristotle or virtue theory, but we'll get to that later today. And then 3, consider utilitarianism, Kantian duty ethics, and virtue ethics. Which theory of ethics do you find most livable? So which ethical theory do you think you could live with in society as we understand it, for example? So those are the 3 prompts on offer for discussion this week. So I'm going to go ahead and create the groups. So I'll make 5 breakout rooms, each with 4 participants. So I'll go ahead and send you there now, and I'll let you know when to start finishing up your conversations. All right, looks like we're all back. So who wants to share some insights from your group?
No ethical theory in its purest form really is, something I would 100% follow. You have to kind of combine some to make your own.
So if this is something your group talked about, what aspects of these theories that we've talked about so far would you recommend preserving and putting into connection with others to create an acceptable theory?
I'd lean more towards rule utilitarianism than act utilitarianism. I feel like the idea of prioritizing for the better good is good, but you also have to think about have some basic ethical rules, like from Kantianism, about what is right and wrong, no matter what.
Okay, good. So we need some rules or principles in order to allow us to perceive where the good, because we have to, again, from utilitarian orientation, we have to consider the good with respect to every potential person impacted by the action or decision, and that can become quite overwhelming and confusing. So sometimes it's important to appeal to abstract or universal principles that can be teased away from the specificity of the circumstances to help out. And so rule utilitarianism is appropriate there, or Kantianism, right? But of course, rules alone aren't going to do everything we want, because after all, and this is an important insight to glean from utilitarian theorists, we really care about the well-being of every person, at least. And some utilitarians, including the original founder of the school of thought from the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham, thought that we should also consider the well-being and happiness of non-human animals that are also sentient. And one deficiency of Kantianism that we haven't addressed, and this is similar to the problem of the social contract tradition, is that non-human, even sentient animals would be excluded, right? So Kant thinks that because animals, non-humans, are not autonomous moral agents, then they cannot actually, that is to say, they have no capacity for reason, and so they cannot be legislators in the overall universal moral law, and they cannot recognize the claim or demand or imposition of the moral law. But that doesn't mean that Kant thinks we can do whatever we want to animals, but if we do harm them, he thinks that the harm is actually not directly to the animal, but to other humans. So for example, people who take pleasure in torturing animals, Kant says, well, they're usually not going to be very nice to people either. And if you torture animals, well, this can actually serve to harden your heart when it comes to a legitimately compassionate relationship with others. And I see Anna has, is that a cat or? Oh, dog, okay. Yeah. And so
I was covering his ears about the torturing part.
Yeah, what's your dog's name?
This is Buddy.
Buddy, oh, cool. Thanks for joining us, Buddy. But Kant would say, if your neighbor, Anna, if you're walking your dog and your neighbor, for whatever reason, decided to kick poor Buddy, that this would be a violation, not against Buddy, but against you as the owner, because Kant recognizes animals as property, just like anything else. And that's a shortcoming in his theory. Peter Singer, one of the major contemporary utilitarians, whom we'll be reading about and discussing in week 6. So when we get into applied ethics, he, among other things, is a very prominent and influential advocate for animal rights. And he thinks along utilitarian lines that moral badness is what perpetrates pain or suffering on an individual that is, by its very constitution or nature, capable of experiencing suffering or pleasure. And therefore, if we can do moral wrong or harm to humans because humans can suffer, well, then it stands to reason that the same can be done to at least certain animals that are capable of suffering no less than humans are. Okay, so any other interesting stuff that you want to share that came out of your breakout rooms?
I have a question about the virtuous standpoint with the grandma and the baby situation. What if the grandma decides to use herself? Like, are you allowed to use yourself? Or you know people, you can't use whatever?
Well, so first, what's the situation? So we're all on the same page. If you could just describe it, the grandma and the baby situation.
Yeah, just like hit the grandma or the baby. So I think I understand, like,
okay.
Like if the grandma told the person to do it, like the person still, I don't know, I'm kind of tore up about that. If the grandma tells whoever's making the decision to pull, well, I guess if it's an automatic car, you know what I'm saying? Or like, or if the grandma pulls the lever on herself, like, is she using her body so it's still not okay?
Well, Kantian ethics certainly endorses self-sacrifice, right? Because one can sacrifice one's own bodily well-being in the interest of higher principles, right? But you can also violate yourself from Kant's point of view, in which case you might, and this is how he describes the instance of suicide. In cases of suicide, one is effectively using oneself as a means to the end of getting out of misery or suffering. And that is a contradiction for Kant because, and this is how he articulates the suicide's motivation, which I think we can critically question. But he says the suicide thinks like this: out of self-love, out of love for myself and desire to no longer suffer, I will destroy myself. And so he takes that to be self-contradictory.
So, but if the grandma pulls the lever, is it not suicide because it's not in a selfish way, it's in an unselfish way?
Well, it's hard to say with Kant, and that's perhaps a difficulty of his theory, but
yeah, I'm having a hard time like imagining a scenario that I can get behind.
Yeah, I mean, either way you do it, I mean, even if in the grandma's own case or the whoever's standing at the lever confronting this dangerous brakeless trolley, there doesn't seem to be any obvious way to respond that would be satisfying along the theoretical lights of Kant, because even if you decide to sacrifice your own self, if that were somehow a part of the situation, then a Kantian might argue that you are, and it would depend on the maxim that you come up with to some extent, and that's a part of the difficulty. But a Kantian still might say that you are using yourself as a means. But then you have to ask, well, what is this use of oneself as a means for? And I don't know, you could answer that in a number of ways, but when it comes to virtue theory, so going back to the grandma and the baby situation, what we're really talking about is programming self-driving cars, right? So just to be clear, that's the situation. But it's very difficult to imagine how an engineer might program virtue into a machine, right? So I'm not sure that virtue theory could help with that kind of situation. Now, the programmers themselves can appeal to something like the Aristotelian table of virtues, where we find the so-called golden mean articulated. They might appeal to something like that when they're making decisions on how to program the car, but it's not entirely clear how that would look as an actual process. Does that make sense? Yeah, so then I guess what we can really say about the trolley problem and all the endless iterations or versions of it is that it's only a a problem easily solved from the perspective of utilitarianism. And so you can maybe do with that what you want. Perhaps you think that that is a reason to accept utilitarianism, or maybe that makes you more suspicious of utilitarianism. I don't know. But yeah, those are some good questions. But what would the virtuous person do? Kill a baby or kill a grandma? Well, I don't know. Those kinds of artificial situations that we find in the case of the trolley problem, I don't know if they're all that helpful, really, because when do we ever find ourselves in a situation where we have to decide between a baby and grandma? These happen only in like Batman movies or something.
In philosophy
These situations. Huh?
In philosophy class.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned this before. I suspect that these scenarios tell you more about the person who comes up with them than they can actually helpfully tell you about yourself. I don't know. Okay. So, and the issue why Kant can't help us so much with this is because, remember, from the point of view of Kant, you should be able to decide ethically as an autonomous moral agent driven by universal intersubjective reason. You should be able to decide what to do irrespective entirely of the concrete conditions that make up the situation. And that's a little strange if you think about it deeply, because you find yourself in a difficult, concrete, ethical situation where you don't know how to act. And Kant tells you, well, you can figure out how to act by ignoring the details of the situation. And so given that the trolley problem is all about these situational details, well, then that makes pretty good sense as to why Kant can't help us here, right? Okay. So any other thoughts? But so before we jump back into Kant, because we didn't talk about this, we entertained many potential and actual glaring deficiencies when it comes to act utilitarianism. But how well does rule utilitarianism fare? What are some problems with rule utilitarianism? This isn't something that Vaughan doesn't really address. Or this is something that Vaughan doesn't really address in the textbook. Any ideas? I mean, it's a little subtle, some problems with that theory. So John Stuart Mill came up with the idea of rule utilitarianism for various reasons, mostly because of the apparent monstrosity of some of the consequences that we find if we take Bentham's system very seriously, right? But so instead of focusing on individual actions, we should make sense of societal rules, which would either render such actions praiseworthy or blameworthy. But then Mill still says these rules or principles are intermediary, secondary principles, and we can understand virtues too as such secondary or intermediate principles from Mill's point of view, which means they have value or sense. They are intelligible in their role as such secondary principles only because they serve the end of the primary principle of pleasure or happiness. So then critics point out that there is something of a tension in Mill's thought, right? Because there are obviously situations we can consider where nobody really would be harmed if you as an individual agent violate a principle or a rule. So if the interest of holding on to and recognizing these rules is simply to maintain happiness or pleasure, why the hell would you go along with the rule, right? Why wouldn't you just break the rule? Because that would mean greater happiness. But when you do that, you've now left rule utilitarianism and you found yourself back in act utilitarianism. And you have to wonder, well, when can I justify breaking these rules for the ultimate pursuit of pleasure? there's no third standard to appeal to tell you when you can find exceptions for the rules. So then you're just sort of thrown back into the wilderness of act utilitarianism. But then on the other hand, if you say, okay, I'll make it so that there are no exceptions for these rules. Well, you're not a utilitarian anymore. Well, now you're a Kantian, right? So that's the problem with rule utilitarianism. It seems that many situations where it would be useful put us in a position to either unhelpfully collapse back into the problems of act utilitarianism or to turn you into a Kantian. So does that make sense? Okay, good. So let's jump back into the presentation from last time, and maybe we'll take 20 or so minutes to continue working through this and to examine some of the implications of Kant's theory and to handle some critics' approaches. And then we'll take a little break and we'll turn to Aristotle. So, all right, so this was the decision procedure, which again is a procedure that takes up the first formulation of the categorical imperative, remember, which says act in such a way that your maxim that informs your action, that renders it intelligible, can be, in fact, a universal law of nature. So that's the first rule in a nutshell, the first rule as the first formulation of the categorical imperative. So we plugged in a particular problem or scenario into these steps, right? So we talked about the prospect of making a false promise, perhaps a version of lying, in order to extricate oneself from a financial difficulty, right? So the problem is to make a false promise for the expedient end of getting some financial reward. It necessitates other people in the world actually believing what you promise. That is, it necessitates, in a logical sense, a more or less consistent and universally recognized truth of what it even means to engage in promise making. So the problem is, by turning the act of false promising into a universal law of nature that everyone recognizes, you end up undercutting the logical sense and universal intelligibility of what it means to promise at all. Because now anytime you say, I promise X, the other recognizes or understands what you're saying as not promising, as doing the opposite of promising. So this is the situation in which you can't even conceive of a world in which it is, in fact, a duty, so to speak, to make false promises. And because you can't conceive of that kind of world, well, that's sufficient to tell you that the act of making a false promise is not acceptable. It's not morally permissible. Okay. So we can talk about some other situations. But before we do that, let's go back to the scenario of the potentially dishonest shopkeeper that Kant uses as an example and that I mentioned briefly before moving into the false promising situation. So again, imagine you are, and this is important for a couple of reasons. One is to indicate through concrete demonstration of giving a real example how your motives can be over-determined. We often have more than one motivation. So that's the main reason to talk about this example. So imagine the shopkeeper who is trying to figure out what sort of standard of pricing they should maintain. So this person considers keeping a uniform, fair price for all customers, or on the other hand, potentially modifying the prices of goods in view of the perceived status or wealth or poverty, as it were, of the customers. And so there are a couple ways to articulate one's reasoning in pursuing this question and trying to find an adequate solution. So one might think, as this shopkeeper, well, I don't think I should vary the prices of goods because if people get word of that, if it comes out in the community that I am wildly varying prices based upon who comes into the store, well, then they might be upset about that and not shop at my store, and they'll go elsewhere. Therefore, it makes sense. It's prudential to keep a uniform price for everything. And then let's say, on the other hand, the shopkeeper thinks, I'm going to maintain a simple uniform price for all of my goods just because that seems to be the right thing to do, right? That's the honest thing to do. Now, Kant would say, although functionally, perhaps from a consequentialist point of view, and in fact, really, from a consequentialist point of view, both considerations are identical, right? Because they both result in exactly the same consequences. But Kant would say they are fundamentally different. There's actually a kind of abyss that separates them. They're not even comparable. On the one hand, the shopkeeper who makes the decision to impose a uniform price on all goods, regardless of the customer, for the reason of financial gain, right? Seeing that the alternative would be bad for the bottom line or whatever else, Kant would say that that person's decision, the motivation for action, is not moral at all. That doesn't make it immoral, however. It makes it amoral, non-moral, because the motivations that the individual is considering are completely beyond the purview of morality, because morality insists upon the deployment of pure practical reason, which just means, in fact, it is pure practical reason is just synonymous with a good will. A good will is a will that is constrained by the rule of reason. And as he points out in the groundwork, it's really only rational agents who are capable of recognizing, respecting, responding to, and actually proposing reasons as rules, right? And so then it's really only the shopkeeper who decides to maintain a uniform price on all goods because that is his or her duty. That's what he or she determines is the right thing to do, and is doing it simply because it is the right thing to do. It is only that sort of motive that has a legitimate moral valence to it, that it can be accurately described as ethical. Does that make sense? But the utilitarian would say, well, it doesn't really matter, right? If the end result seems to be good, well, then the motive doesn't matter. But I suspect all of us, if not all of us, many of us here have some suspicions about that. I mean, at least it matters at least a little bit what's motivating your action, right? Okay, so let's talk a little more about these other duties. So Kant breaks down these duties into these 4 categories. So there are, of course, perfect and imperfect duties, which we've talked about before, and those split along the lines of what is, a contradiction in conception. So that's where you find perfect duties, versus a contradiction in will. So that's where you find imperfect duties. But then there's also duties with respect to oneself and duties in connection to others. So we've already talked about duty, this perfect duty to others, not to lie and not to make false promises, because such behaviors violate, in a straightforward sense, the contradiction in conception clause of the first formulation of the categorical imperative. And then we also talked a little bit about the imperfect duty that we have to help others, right? So you can conceive of a world in which you and no one else helps anyone, right? So it passes that test. But the problem is you can't will such a world into existence where nobody helps anyone else, because that means implicitly that you're denying yourself help, when you should recognize as a finite, vulnerable person that in some cases you depend upon the goodwill of others, right? We are not isolated atomic individuals existing in a vacuum, right? sorry, I have a direct message in the chat. So this could be something to address to the class. Let me just read this real quick. Yeah, so Justin was asking me in the chat about how these kinds of moral theoretical considerations, how they might apply to the kind of program that states are struggling with for COVID vaccination, right? So he says someone has decided who should get the shot and when, right? So yeah, that seems to be a moral consideration, right? To whom should we first give the shot, given that we have perhaps minimal or finite resources, and time as a factor, right? And then there are also populations that are more vulnerable than others. So he says a utilitarian person could think that giving the vaccine to the older population may not be better for the society. Do you want to say more about that, Justin? So how do you think, I suspect you could be right.
Well, I think some people may think that giving it to the older people who have less time to live would not be as good as giving it to younger people who have a longer time to live and could be more happy, I guess. Not maybe the best word to use, but I'm just trying to decide how they figure out, and what kind of theory they use to decide who's more important in a situation like this.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a really good question.
I was in a car with a girlfriend, and she can get one because she works at a hospital. Mm-hmm. I could have just as very well said I work at a hospital and got mine right there too. But would that be morally right because I'm stepping in line in front of older people? That's kind of what I'm getting at here.
Yeah. So what are some thoughts from the rest of you about that? Those are some interesting and important and very much relevant questions. Any thoughts about that? So who should?
So what do you think?
Well, I want other people to do some thinking here, right? So maybe leaving these theories aside, because these are real world concrete problems that have serious consequences and implications, right? So what should one do who's in a position to determine how these vaccines are distributed and made available, right? So what kind of principles ought to be looked at or taken more seriously? Because as Justin has helpfully pointed out, there are different principles we could turn to make sense of what's at stake, right? So someone from a kind of utilitarian point of view might look at the elderly population as those who are, because of their waning life, as those who have the possibility of a smaller quantity of pleasure. And therefore, just like in the comic we looked at, so someone who has like a poor liver and can't enjoy alcohol, well, they won't get the pleasure of alcohol. So why should, why should we care more about them and the health of their organs if we're considering people as just containers of pleasure, right? Well, from a Kantian point of view, though, we might think, and I think perhaps the second formulation is most helpful here, right? The second formulation, to treat everyone, including yourself, as an end rather than a means. So if we decide, for example, to choose against giving the elderly population for the reasons we just discussed, well, Kant might understand that as using the elderly as a means to the end of young people being happier, right?
Well, we just did it though. Let's say we put teachers ahead of the older people because they can do more good with the children in the school. Does that not kind of factor into it as well? Because they're now switching it around quite a bit. So I'm just curious as to how and why those decisions.
Well, it seems like when we decide to give the vaccine to the elderly population, one, if not principle, one moral consideration that is implicitly in play is that is a population that is most vulnerable, such that if they are exposed, if members of that population are exposed to the virus, then they would have a greater chance of death, hence suffering, misery. So from that point of view, even a utilitarian would recommend giving that population first go or first dibs or putting them ahead in the line. But I mean, there are other ways to think about the good and perhaps more problematic ways to think about the good. But also educators that you mentioned. And so I've looked into this myself as someone who's interested in getting a vaccine. They are high up on the line, maybe for reasons that you're mentioning. And so.
However, that also depends upon the state. We're one of only a couple states that have that.
Yeah, and I mean, that just tells you that there are multiple starting points in terms of standards that can help us sort out these difficulties. And well, maybe that's the human condition. There are all these different standards that we're talking about, but there's no super standard above all of them that we can just turn to and say, all right, this sorts it all out for us. And that's the complexity of these moral problems, right? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we could spend really all day talking about it. I mean, this is a fascinating issue, right? And this is something that we would have spent quite a bit of time talking about in the context of medical ethics, but we ended up going with, by the class vote, the issue of abortion or reproductive rights instead. Yeah, but does it help at all what we talked about?
Yeah, it does. It's just been popping around in my head. I've come up with different theories, and I just haven't really quite settled on which one I think is the right one yet. Other than I'm glad I'm not Kate Brown making the decisions. Yeah, it's hard. And I think that that's something we ought to keep in mind. And this is the benefit of thinking about and studying ethics too, that we put ourselves in a position to be more compassionate or more respectful of those who are in these difficult positions, right? Maybe as, standing on the sidelines, it's very easy for all of us to say, oh, she should be doing this, or she should implement this strategy or whatever. But it's a different matter altogether when you are occupying that role of someone who has to decide in some way, which can bring about devastating consequences, right? Good, okay. Thank you for that. And so then, yeah, we don't need to talk too much about this. We did discuss already suicide. So you have a perfect duty to preserve yourself, even in the experience of profound unhappiness or pain. But keep this in mind. So this is an issue we'll turn to in week 7 when we get to physician-assisted suicide, when we examine that from the perspective of Kantianism. Because on the one hand, given Kant's prohibition against suicide, it seems fairly clear where a Kantian would stand on the ethical permissibility of physician-assisted suicide. But then it's not so straightforward, as we'll see. There are different ways that even a Kantian might take up that question. And then you also, according to Kant, have an imperfect duty to yourself to not just smoke dope and play video games all day until you're 70 years old in your parents' basement, right? To actually do something. It's an imperfect duty because, again, similar to the imperfect duty to others, we can conceive of a world in which we don't develop our talents. But then we would be denying others, including ourselves, if we think of other people who aren't developing their skills and abilities and improving themselves. We would, in effect, be denying ourselves the promise and the contribution and benefit that such self-cultivation amounts to.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the second formulation, the so-called means-end principle. So this is the one, Justin, that I was talking about earlier that I thought is particularly applicable to the question we were just considering. So act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end and never as a means only. Now, I should point out that according to Kant, in the language of the groundwork, all of these formulations, and there are multiple, not just the two, all of these formulations of the categorical imperative, according to Kant, amount to the same principle. They're not different principles. They're just different ways of getting at the same issue. So it's not that some actions can pass or fail the first version, but not the second version. If an action under consideration fails the first formulation, well, then it ought to fail the second too. It's just that the language in these different formulations is more clearly helpful in making sense of cases than others, depending upon the circumstances. But here's a question. So what exactly does Kant mean that we ought not to treat others as a means? So when you go to a store, when you go to Safeway to buy groceries, aren't you really using the cashier as a means to your end of obtaining goods and ultimately feeding yourself? So what's going on there? Is that right or not? I mean, notice this important qualifier here. A means only. We should never treat others as a mere means or as only a means to our own end. And that's because human beings, as rational autonomous agents, are fundamentally ends in ourselves. That means we can't simply be used as tools by others to achieve certain ends, whether those ends are noble, as is often the case when applying utilitarian theory, right? So what would it look like if you were to violate this version of the categorical imperative while shopping? So how might you treat a cashier as a mere means?
If you just ignored them and like didn't look at them or didn't talk to them and just put your card in, put your groceries up there, walk away.
Yeah, something like that, where you're basically treating them as a computer or something. So perhaps the clerk initiates some friendly small talk with you and you're just like, hey, whatever, just shut the fuck up, put it in the bag. That would be pretty wrong, I think. I mean, it would be clearly rude, but what Kant would argue that that's a moral wrong, a kind of harm, albeit comparatively a relatively minimal one, but it's not nothing, right? You should respect the autonomy of that person who is working in such a way that you recognize that they don't exist as merely a worker for your interest. They have their own life, they have their own interests, desires, hopes, dreams, family, and so forth. You might also treat them as a mere means if you decide to deceive or rob them, right? So if you're a shoplifter and you distract a clerk or something so that you can get away with lifting some goods, well, that would be treating them as a mere means to your end of satisfaction. And so it's something we have to keep in mind that Kant knows this, that we're always treating others, even ourselves in some sense, as means. We treat our friends as means, right? Because we like friendship. It's good for us. It helps us become happy people. But the problem is when we start to treat our friends as merely a means to the end of our happiness, in which case you might say you're not really a very good friend. Okay. So, I mean, there are some issues to bring up, and I don't want to spend too much more time on this. I really want to focus on one particular criticism, which I think is a valid one against Kant. But this idea of conflicting duties, so in the textbook, for example, Vaughan says, well, Kant says you can't break a promise, right? There's a perfect duty against breaking promises. So what if you promise to meet your friend for lunch and you're on the way and you find someone who is in some kind of predicament where perhaps their life is on the line. But if you stop to help them, well, that means you'll miss your lunch appointment. Well, helping others is an imperfect duty, right? As we've already seen, Vaughan says that not breaking promises is a perfect duty. So Kant would argue you have to just let the person die and go meet your friend for lunch. Well, that seems obviously, profoundly idiotic, right? Nobody thinks that that's what you should do in that kind of situation. But that should be enough to tell you that's not what Kant would say. I mean, Kant is a profound giant of thought in the history of philosophy. He is considered among Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, maybe Descartes, as among the greatest thinkers of all time. So it would be positively ludicrous to think that you could dismiss his moral theory with such a superficial objection, right? So what would Kant say? There is no perfect duty against breaking promises, because you can make a promise. You can tell your friend, I promise, yeah, I'm gonna meet you for lunch at 3 o'clock. But then you get a flat tire, you miss it. Are you suddenly immoral? No, that's a consequence that occurs in the world that remains fundamentally, by its very nature, inaccessible to your prior understanding. And this is why Kant, for one reason at least, why Kant's a non-consequentialist. You have no control, ultimately, over all of the variable factors that could happen in the world that stand in the way of you fulfilling your duty. So that's why we're considering only motive, incentive. So the violation against perfect duty is not breaking a promise, it's actively making a false promise. So if you tell your friend, yeah, I'll meet you at 3 o'clock, when at the same time you're thinking to yourself, have fun waiting. I'm not coming. Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, you're an asshole. But secondly, Kant would say, you're violating a perfect duty. You're making a false promise. So one principle that informs Kant's philosophy is ought implies can. So if I say, you ought to do that, or you ought to have done that, and you tell me, well, I couldn't. I wasn't able to. I was, in a car accident, or something fell from the sky and knocked me out, right? Or there was a natural disaster or something. I couldn't do it. Well, then it makes no sense to say that you should have done it. And so in that way, at least Kant's theory is fairly commonsensical, right? And so I think this whole business of some less important duties seemingly in given situations trumping more important duties is really a non-starter. But here is a very common objection to Kant. So this is the classic murderer at the door example, which at a certain point in the 20th century was reformulated to be the Nazi stormtrooper at the door example, because people are obsessed with Nazis. But this is a problem that Kant was presented with by critics in the 18th century. So imagine, and this is how it's presented, that someone is in a state of panic. They come to your door and they say, look, someone's trying to kill me. Can I please hide in your house? Help me. And you say, yeah, come in. And then a few minutes later, someone with a knife knocks on your door and says, did someone just come in here? I'm looking for them. You would, because Kant says there are no exceptions to the prohibition by the lights of the categorical imperative against lying, you would have to tell them. And so this is a kind of a funny illustration here of Kant being in this situation with his mother, right? But is that right? I mean, what do you guys think about this scenario? How do you think Kant might respond to this? And he, in fact, ultimately, and this is a kind of appendix, so a bit of a supplement that's usually attached to versions of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals that you can purchase. It's known as, well, his response is known as on the supposed philanthropic right to, or on the supposed right to lie for philanthropic reasons. So philanthropic reasons would be reasons of love for other human beings, such as this would-be murder victim. So out of love for this potential murder victim, you have a right to lie to the would-be murderer. Kant actually, in this pamphlet, he denies that famously. He says, no, you still do not have a right to lie, because in that case, you would still be using the potential murderer as a means to your own end. Whether that end is selfish or selfless or whatever else, it still would be the end of saving the life of the other person. But what do you think of this situation?
I wouldn't have opened the door in the first place to someone with a knife.
That's what I was going to say.
Good. No one said that your options are lie or tell the truth, right? You might not open the door. Or maybe you'll tell them, hey, you're a fucking murderer. I'm not letting you in here. I'm going to call the cops. There are all sorts of things that you could do that don't involve lying. And more helpfully, I think, is to point out that lying is not necessarily something that would be beneficial in this situation. Let's say you lie to the murderer, but they know damn well you're lying because they saw the person come in and now they murder you too. Or what if while you're lying, the other person, without you knowing it, sneaks out and maybe in some measure because of your lie, the murderer at the door leaves, and at that moment they happen upon the person, right? So your lie, without you intending it, actually brought about the murder more easily. You actually helped the murderer. So the point here is we should really, as moral agents, care about our intentions to act, because that's what we have control over. If I am honest, well, that means I'm not using the other person. I am not intentionally deceiving them, which is to exploit their finitude, their vulnerability as subjects who have imperfect knowledge in the world. When I lie, that's basically what I'm doing. I'm using people's frailty and weakness against them. But when we're honest, or when we avoid lying, we are exhibiting or expressing respect for that individual's autonomy. That is, giving them whatever they need, the resources of truth to make a decision for themselves. But that doesn't mean that you at every moment have an obligation as a kind of truth-telling machine, right? Because Kant thinks that we are all free, autonomous individuals. You don't have to just go around telling everyone the truth. But if someone asks you the truth, you ought to be honest in some way. That is to say, you ought not to deceive them. And this is what he means by a good will being the only thing in existence that is good without qualification. It's always good. So so imagine there's like a burning building and you want to run in and save someone, but you're not a trained fireman and you end up causing more harm than good. Well, your intentions were good. So you would say you're still not immoral. We might say you're stupid, or we might say you're thoughtless, and perhaps you shouldn't have done that. But we wouldn't consider you a bad person, right? Because your intention was good. And so the main takeaway from all this is that we very often have very minimal control over all of the variables that occur to contribute to a certain result. And so we ought to, as moral agents, care more about our intentions, whether they're good or not, because at least that's what we can exert control over in our autonomy. So let me see. I want to skip through some stuff because we're out of time. Wait, where did it go? Oh, here it is. This is what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so this is the last slide we'll work through in connection to Kant's theory. So as I've been trying to emphasize, operating on a sense of duty is very important, and that is to say necessary, but it might not be everything. In other words, it might not be sufficient, as Kant seems to hold. So we've already seen how motives can be overdetermined, like the shopkeeper example. So the shopkeeper might be driven by two motives. First of all, to preserve his financial well-being, right? And that's why the shopkeeper decides to impose a uniform price and everything. But then another motive would be to just impose a uniform price and everything because that's the right thing to do. But in that situation, there's more than one motive, only one is correct. And so one strange version or one strange implication or consequence of Kant's theory is that given a plurality of potential motives, it is not necessarily the case that one is immoral for having more than one motive. You can have all sorts of motives. As long as you have the truly moral motive, you're still moral in your decision. But Kant thinks, however, those whose actions are not, that is, those whose motives are not overdetermined. So someone who is driven purely by the motive of duty is at least more obviously, more clearly moral than others. So think of someone who has a friend in the hospital because of an accident. And let's say you have a friend in the hospital because of an accident, but you are not a particularly warm and loving individual. You might even be a bit of a misanthrope. You don't really care about helping others so much. It gives you no pleasure, but, and you hate hospitals too. So you really don't want to go to the hospital, but you muster up the strength and courage and you go because you recognize that that's your duty. That's what friends do. And you show up to the hospital and your friend says, "Oh, wow, I'm so happy to see you. I'm in pain and I've been so lonely and bored. Thank you for coming." And you say, "Okay, but hold on. I just want you to know that I don't want to be here. I am getting absolutely no happiness out of seeing you. I, in fact, hate being here. I'm going to leave in a few minutes. All right. I don't want to be here. I'm only here because it's my duty." Right? That's all I'm here for. According to Kant, you would be obviously moral, more obviously moral than someone who out of legitimate compassion and love goes to see their sick friend in the hospital. And I think there's something wrong about that. I don't know. I think that's more indicative of a kind of pathological moral character rather than an obviously strong moral character. Because however important duty is, there also seems to be something important about legitimate care, right? Compassion, and we can consider these virtues, right? So this is something that virtue ethics can help out with. But does that make sense? This problem with Kant? It seems to be overly dry, cold, and anemic, and for that reason deficient in capturing the fullness of our moral lives and what we think is important in making moral decisions. But of course, we can't just leave duty out because, and this is what's helpful about Kant in this situation, there are individuals who have, to put it in this way, sociopathic tendencies. That is, people who are by their very natural constitution incapable of feeling compassion or care or love for others. But should this necessarily mean that they are, in virtue of that failing, incapable of being moral? Well, no, I think we might be able to think of someone along the lights of the situation Kant articulates. Someone who thinks, look, I fucking hate helping others. I don't want to be a friend to anybody, but I know it's my duty, so I'm going to force myself to do it. Well, there's something respectable. There's something noble about that, even if we don't think that that's the best way we ought to be. Okay. So I'll stop there because I've taken way too much time on Kant. But are there any final questions or comments about Kant? All right, so let's so we'll forego the break today. Sorry, guys, we'll just jump right into virtue theory. I apologize that, but I want to save more time, first of all, for our discussion of feminism next week, and then also for any kinds of questions that we can entertain in the review. So let's just work through virtue theory here. Okay. All right, so it's interesting that we're at this point now, after working through utilitarianism, Kantianism, addressing Aristotelian ethics, because here we're talking about something over 2,000 years old, right? But I set and scheduled the discussion of virtue theory the way I did because it's rather unique in connection to these more modern moral approaches. And that's because the virtue ethicist, Aristotle in particular, and that's the theory on which we'll spend time in our discussion, virtue ethicists focus instead on individual actions rather on one's character, one's being in the world, one's way of life. And that's roughly a series of ways to translate the Greek word ethos, which we still preserve in that same word in English. Right? So we often talk about ethos or ethos. Ethos literally means character. It can also be translated to mean habit or habituation. But to put those two senses together in meaningful connection, the archaic sense of ethos, so the oldest meaning of the word, is actually a reference to an abode or a dwelling place. Right? So the ethos is the place in which one lives one's life and pursues a life of well-being and flourishing. And so that connects to habit as a word with Latin origin and provenance, because think of the way we use versions, different forms, grammatical forms, as it were, semantic forms of habit. So think about how we inhabit our homes, we inhabit our dwelling places. Think about natural habitats as those places in which non-human animals dwell, and ecological niches and so forth. So there is this fundamental relationship between our habits, what we do over time in a way that sediments, that builds up our character, and the way that we live as moral beings in the world, a world populated of others. And so Aristotle asks, rather than how should I act in this or that situation, what should I do? I mean, those questions are of course posed by virtue ethicists, by Aristotle, but those are all questions that are secondary with respect to the overall consideration of what kind of person should I be, right? And so he says in his Nicomachean Ethics, which by the way is named after one of his children, one of Aristotle's sons, Nicomachus. So he dedicated one of his major moral theoretical works to his son. But in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says, with reference to the connection of individual action and one's overall character. He says, a swallow doesn't make a spring, right? So a one-off action in a particular situation isn't sufficient to indicate an overall consistent moral character, right? So let's say you're on a date with someone whom you've just met, and you leave the restaurant and the person sees a homeless person asking for money. They take out like $100 bill and give it to the homeless person, and you think, wow, what a generous guy. This is great. But it could just be that the person's trying to impress you. It could just be that they just got paid. So they're particularly flush and feeling confident and generous, but it's not something they usually do. So we have to focus on character, because we have to focus on what one does in a variety of situations consistently over time. So does that make sense? All right. So I don't want to spend too much time on this complicated table I put together, but this is helpful just to look at Aristotle's overarching system as a theoretical philosopher. So he's a systematic philosopher, as is Immanuel Kant, whom we've talked about already, which means that in his system, there is a place for metaphysics, that is an understanding of reality. There is a place for ethics, so what it means to be good, what it means to act rightly. There's a place for politics, so what sort of social institutions, political organization ought we to contribute to and sustain. There is a place for epistemology, that is questions about how we know things and how we can distinguish legitimate knowledge from mere opinion or belief. And so for Aristotle, we have all these fundamental capacities as intellectual animals, that is rational animals. So we have noesis or thought, we have aesthesis, so that's where we get words in English like aesthetic, for example, which is the capacity or faculty for sense perception. And then we also have desires or orexis. And so building on these fundamental faculties, which define and make possible the kind of life that's appropriate for humans, we get different activities. So here's where we find theoretical activity, which makes possible knowledge in the scientific sense, which makes possible wisdom. And when we're wise, that's the end. We want to be wise just because being wise is good. Understanding truth, the nature of reality. But then over here, because we have sense perception and desire, we're capable of experience. So this is where the word in English empirical comes from, empiria in the Greek. But because we have experience, we can engage in ethics and politics. And if we do that enough, we can get practical wisdom or phronesis. But practical wisdom, unlike theoretical wisdom, is good for praxis. And that's actually where we get the word practical. So this is why, for instance, Kant uses the language of practical reason. It's not practical in the sense of expediency or efficiency. It's practical in the sense of praxis. And praxis from the Greek means some action that follows an intelligent choice or decision, being thoughtful. And so this is where we find in Aristotle's system ethics. We study ethics in order to become practically wise. And we want to become practically wise, not because that's good in itself, but because that will be conducive towards and lead to good actions in a variety of complicated situations. And so I talked about ethos as a word meaning character or also habitual way of being. And so he emphasizes virtue insofar as virtue plays a significant role in this, and not simply abstract, mathematically conceived of, in many cases, principles or rules that govern behavior. And so just to go back to this slide real quick, and this is something to keep in mind, especially when we come to some criticisms of virtue theory. One very interesting thing that, in addition to the others that we've remarked on, that sets Aristotle apart from these more modern theorists, is Aristotle says, because ethics is focused on actions, and actions are made possible if they're going to be good through moral decision making, ethics as a system of thought, or a kind of knowledge or a form of study, is not comparable to, say, episteme or the natural sciences or other theoretical sciences. And so what is theoria for Aristotle? That's where we get words in English like theory. Theoria is a kind of activity in the pursuit of knowledge where we act as disinterested spectators, right? So for Aristotle, the highest kind of object that is disclosable through theoretical reflection would be something like God, the divine. So theology, from Aristotle's point of view, along with metaphysics more broadly, are the highest forms of theoretical thought. And what makes them so? Well, our understanding of God, or our understanding of astronomical bodies like Jupiter or the moon or whatever. However we understand the nature of these things, it's not really going to affect us in any particular way. And also, from Aristotle's point of view, these objects are unchanging and eternal, right? So that's why we look at them as spectators. So if you like watch a baseball game or something on television, your viewing, your engagement with the phenomenon isn't going to change it. It's going to have no effect on it. And it's actually not going to play any important role in the course of your practical life. But ethics is different, right? In ethics, we're thinking about human action, which is always messy. So then Aristotle has this principle. He says, ethics is a messy business. And if you expect the kind of clarity and rigor that you find in mathematics, well, then you're actually not being a rigorous ethicist or moral philosopher. So he says, looking at a moral question and expecting the same kind of answer that you would get from a geometrical proof is just as shitty as it would be if you're a mathematician expecting an answer to a geometrical problem that looks like an ethical answer, right? It would be inappropriate. So we can't expect precision or exactness when it comes to sorting out ethical problems. And that's because, think of a situation like murder, right? We tend to say, at least hopefully, murder is wrong, right? Murder is a bad thing. It's a violation of an ethical norm. Kant would agree, utilitarians would agree, and so forth. But knowing that murder is wrong isn't all that one has to have in place to sort out, for example, in the situation of someone being a juror or a judge, whether or not one has violated this principle, right? So murder isn't simply the act of taking a life, right? Because you can kill someone for self-defense. You might actually do something that ends a life as a soldier on a battlefield, right? But we wouldn't consider those acts as murder. So then to figure out whether a particular state of affairs or action is actually a moral violation or transgression, you can't just, as a mathematician, can know the nature of 2 and 2 to get the sum 4. You can't do that. You have to look at the specific details on the ground, the concrete details that make up the situation to figure out whether someone has behaved morally or immorally. So we can never get perfect, clear, obvious answers when we are exploring ethics, and that's just because of the nature of the enterprise itself. But again, this doesn't mean relativism. It doesn't mean that there is no right and wrong. It just means that we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can get to the right and wrong of a given situation without the hard work of examining all the details and taking them seriously. So, and Vaughan gets this wrong in the chapter. I think he says for Aristotle, every living being has a telos, and telos is translated usually in English to goal or purpose. And so that's where we get words like teleological, which means goal-oriented, purpose-oriented. But telos from the Greek really points to this image of like a target. It's that at which an individual or an action aims. It's that for the sake of which we undertake an action, right? And strictly speaking, for Aristotle's metaphysics, every entity, not just living entities, even a stone has a telos, has some purpose for the sake of which it exists, and that is not a humanistic understood purpose, right? So rocks or anything else don't just exist to serve our narrow human ends. For Aristotle, human beings are not the most important entity in the cosmos. So everything for Aristotle is defined most importantly by its unique telos. And Aristotle actually derived that understanding or this idea from Plato, his teacher. So Plato argued that what makes an action good is precisely the extent to which it conforms with the good as such, the good in itself by itself, the universal form of goodness. Aristotle disagrees with this. He says, it doesn't make sense to appeal to some generic universal good because what's good for me as a human being is not the same as what's good for a beaver or a star or a bacterium, right? There are unique goods that are appropriate for each individual being. And so the first task of ethics then for Aristotle is to figure out what the greatest good is, the highest good, the summum bonum in Latin. So, and that would as well be the unique good in virtue of which human beings are distinguished from other beings. So what is good for us as a particular kind of animal rather than just all animals in general. And so who wants to volunteer? I want to ask a series of questions. Does anybody want to be in the hot seat for a moment?
I can take it.
Okay, Hunter, good. Why, and this is what I do to really flesh out how Aristotle arrives where he does at the beginning. So why are you taking this class?
I'm taking this class because I had fun in the one last term.
Okay. Well, that's a different answer than I was expecting. Because you had fun in the last class, you expect to have fun now. I'm afraid with that answer, we're going to get to the end pretty fast.
I mean, here, I'll give you a better description than fun. Here. I took ethics because I enjoyed the principles in philosophy and I wanted to build upon them and learn how they applied to the people and how people think.
Okay. And so why do you want to do that? So now I'm going to act like an annoying child and just pose another why to everything you say. So why is it important, to build on these ethical or these principles that you learned now in an ethical place to apply them to problems that people face? I mean, why?
It got me thinking a different way.
Huh?
So it got me thinking a different way, more analytically.
Why do you want to think in a different way?
Well, it gave me the logical backing of other logical thinkers. So then I was able to rationalize my thoughts with other accepted principles. And then because that got me curious, I wanted to expand upon it.
Okay, so I can distill that down to maybe say you want to learn how to think rationally or maybe behave rationally. But why do you want to do that?
Because I don't know how. Plain and simple.
But why do you want to learn how? Why? I mean, surely there are a number of things you don't know how to do.
I mean, yeah, that's just part of life is you're always learning new things. You can't know everything. But the reason I want to do it is because it genuinely interests me. And So I would like to learn what I can about it, so that way I can, progress further from there, see if it's a potential career option or if it's just something to keep in my thoughts.
All right, so let's say it could help with the career. Why do you want a career?
Well, even if I don't make it a major, like, it's got a lot of really good principles that'll help me think through different situations in life. How I encounter or interact with people.
Let's stay with the career thing, though, that you floated there.
Well, like with the boss or something, I would know how to interact morally or ethically in a situation where maybe I'm unhappy, but I need to use one of these principles provided and, respect him more or whatever.
Like, why? I mean, I have a job, presumably. I mean, to put this in crass terms, I mean, many college students are here because they think that's the avenue, which might be necessary or might be not, towards fulfilling, to some extent, employment. But why do you want a job? I mean, why not just, I don't know.
I like the commodities of society, so I need some money in order to interact with the economy.
Yeah, and so why do you like money? What's so great about that?
I can buy my own happiness.
Yeah, but you see, this can go on and on and on for a long time, depending upon where we begin with the question and answer. But the point of all of this is, at some point, and we can take all these circuitous different paths, but at some point the questions would stop because there's no other thing to say. And Aristotle thinks that that point of termination is happiness, right? So if you say, well, I want to get a job because I need money, or well, I like money. If I ask you, why do you like money? Because I need to, pay rent and buy myself food and clothes. Well, why do you like that? Eventually you have to say, well, because I want to be happy. And then if I ask, well, why do you want to be happy? The next question or the next response is, I don't know, because I want to be happy.
Duh.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the process through which Aristotle arrives at eudaimonia, which is, I think, problematically translated in English to happiness, because we tend to think of happiness as one fleeting emotional state that can be replaced with another. So right now I'm happy. Maybe later I'll be depressed. Maybe later I'll be scared. Maybe later I'll be nostalgic. So we have all these different emotional states. But that's not exactly what Aristotle means, because you can be eudaimonic, you can be happy in this sense and be angry too. In fact, he would insist that in certain situations you ought to be angry. There's something defective about your response if you're not angry, which means your behavior is not conducive towards your own well-being and happiness. So eudaimonia, which literally means like a good spirit. So that's where we get demon, for example, in English. It comes from the Greek daimon. And then the prefix eu, we find, as we'll see in a couple of weeks when we get to physician-assisted suicide, in a word like euthanasia. Euthanasia literally means a good death. So thanasia comes from thanatos, the Greek word for death. So to be happy in this sense means you are possessed, in a word, by this good spirit. You are flourishing. You're living the good life consistently over time. And that's ultimately what everyone desires. Everyone wants to be happy. It's just that we have a different understanding of what would make us happy. We tend to disagree about that. And so this is a distinction that we've talked about already, first in the context, I think, of utilitarianism. Aristotle thinks that happiness, because it meets these criteria, is the only thing that's good in itself, right? So money is instrumentally good. It's only misers who kind of hold on to it, who hoard it, and they don't put it into work, who mistake an instrumental good for an intrinsic good. Money is essentially relational. It's only good because it can get you something else that's good. But happiness isn't instrumentally relational for anything beyond itself, except, well, this isn't beyond itself. It's good for nothing but more happiness. And so that's what we do everything for. Okay, so yeah, we're out of time, but let me stop there. Yeah, so we're out of time. We'll talk a little bit. So we left off before getting into virtue specifically, but I'll just say this very quickly and we'll jump back into it on Monday, or yeah, Monday, sorry. Virtue is translated from arete, which really means excellence. So everything, remember, has its unique telos, or end, or that for the sake of which it exists. But not every end is equally met by the individual or entity in question, right? So think of a knife. A knife has a telos. The telos of a knife is to cut, right? But not all knives are equally good for cutting. So some knives are duller than others. So a particularly strong and sharp, effective knife, Aristotle would say, has a good arete. It has virtue. It's a virtuous knife. So then the human being who is best able to fulfill its unique function, its unique good or telos of happiness, would be most virtuous, would participate most in excellence. And so that's where the virtues come into play as a necessary means to the fulfillment of one's individual happiness. Okay, so we'll stop there, but are there any final comments or questions about anything? All right, so yeah, I'll upload this video, and of course the slides are available in the shared drive on Moodle. So if you wanted to continue looking at these slides for Aristotle, but I'll see you guys next week. I hope you have a good weekend, and we'll resume this discussion, and then we'll transition to ethics of care, which in some ways can be considered a kind of virtue ethics. Okay, so have a good weekend, guys. I'll see you next week.
Have a good one.
What's the deal with midterms?
Oh, yeah, so the midterm is, as I've mentioned, it's due next week. So a week from this Sunday, but it opens up for the entire week. So after midnight, Sunday night, it'll be available. But again, I recommend waiting until after our session Wednesday, because we'll wrap up these conversations about the various theories in the moral theoretical landscape, and then we'll have a chance for just an overall review session.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so the exam's available all week, but once you open it, you have a 2-hour window in which to complete it, right? And it is obviously open book because, I mean, why isn't it? There's no one to watch you, so it'd be silly for me to tell you not to. I mean, so you have all of the resources available for you to take the exam. Any other questions about that?
Would you consider the exam to be difficult?
Well, it's hard for me to say. I don't think it is. If you've done the reading, if you've participated in these class discussions, and you practice with the flashcards, for example. So if you test your understanding with that, I wouldn't be too worried about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thanks, guys. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.